Welcome, Professor Marsh. We're so excited to have the author of two pieces that we've read this semester here. And we have so many questions. The students sent in a bunch of questions, and I thought maybe I would sort of call on people um, to walk us through the different questions, but I think it might be best if we just sort of people just ask as they'd like.
Sounds good. And
But
I also just want to say thank you so much for having me. To have two pieces of my writing and my work in a single course feels very special. So I'm really excited to gonna have this conversation with y'all, especially after I read your amazing book, No God But Man. I read it, I think it was in September, and it just was like, this is it. So thanks for inviting me.
No, I appreciate you saying that so much. And it really means a lot seeing the kind of overlap in our work from otherwise very different, like geographic and other sorts of approaches. Um, it's a question, my first kind of opening question to you sort of speaks a bit to what you talk about in that in the other piece we read for this class where you do talk a bit about my book. But really, it starts with something you say in your amazing book, Textual Life. And it's where you're critiquing Edward Said, sort of engaging with him, and then also critiquing him. And with that, you have a sentence that really just jumped out at me, where you say that, oh my gosh, where is it? Okay, I think it's there. But anyway, what you say is that the irrelevance of the textual attitude has liberated it from the burden of representation and instrumentality. And that really struck me because it's a pretty optimistic view. Like it gives te the textual attitude this kind of promise that I feel like in most spaces I'm in, there's like a general pessimism about it, that we are in an anti-intellectual time. People don't read anymore. They definitely don't read like they used to. Um, but in the story that you're telling in this book, I can really see this way that, in the move from the colonial philologist to then the spy, the state agent of various kinds, the bureaucrat, blah, 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 that there is a way that the textual attitude shifts completely. And like you say, is liberated. And so I was wondering if there's a way that that connects to what you call a fugitive hermeneutics of Blackness. Like, is that the fugitive part, you know? And then what does that sort of mean for the discipline, for Black studies? I know the students have a bunch of questions about discipline from Black studies to area studies to philology. So this might lead into that. Um,
Sure.
but I'm really curious to hear what you think.
Yeah. I mean, this is a great question to start off with. I hadn't actually thought of those two pieces together, right? Textual attitude on one hand and fugitive hermeneutics. Uh, Mostly because I think, I wrote the book, submitted the book for publication, almost really. I guess when was that? It feels like a different time, but a while ago. And I wrote the Reconsidering Race and Islamic Studies piece just in September. It was one of the shortest spans of time on an academic piece of writing. I think I wrote it in like 6 weeks. But the in the with textual attitude, I can just kind of briefly kind of sketch that out. Textual attitude is an orientation toward the world through meaningfully composed text, right? Through reading. And I am kind of juxtaposing that, contrasting that with the practical attitude, which is about getting things done, right? It's about the kind of engineer's mentality that the world is out there and it is to be measured and acted upon so as to be mastered and controlled. Whereas the textual attitude is all about it is hermeneutic, right? It is interpretive. It is actually trying, it sees the world not as something to be manipulated and conquered, but something but as a set of signs, right? That have to be read. And as I said, I hadn't thought about those two together, but just kind of talking it out right now, there are definitely some affinities. There are definitely some affinities, but I can also say that the textual attitude, as I came to understand it from years of study with Kamara, in and through the kind of prism of also thinking about Edward Said and his kind of critical contributions, um, textual attitude is an idea that I formulated to describe a perennial orientation toward the world, one that is, um, one might say, permanent. And I say that with some hesitancy and some reluctance because, like, nothing is permanent, nothing is historical. And yet, when we think about intellectual histories all over the world, one of the kind of core features is this um, search for meaning, right? That intellectuals are often engaged in. And so, um, in the book, I kind of tell a story where the textual attitude had a kind of moment in colonial French West Africa, but then that is replaced by the practical attitude. But since publishing it, I've kind of come to the idea that actually these are permanent tensions and that there are orientations to knowledge that are kind of always battling. And so for our day to day, in the university, the practical attitude is winning out without a doubt, without a question, right? It is the way that we talk about course credits and hours and um, the way the just expectations that students have around getting things done. Uh, but at the same time, and this is where my optimism, if not my hope, comes in, which is I think we're seeing like new forms of thoughtful engagement emerge. I think there's something about like the human mind that, no matter how historical shifts might change the form, and particular practices around intellectual life that there's an old Outcast lyric that goes something like, we can't do something no more than we can bob our head off beat. It's like we can't help it. Like that's we are meaning seeking, meaning creating beings. And so ultimately we have to come back to study. We have to return to study because we can't help it to do otherwise.
That makes so much sense that there's no way to sort of snuff it out completely when we are meaning-seeking creatures.
Hmm.
It raises questions for me about the specific place, task, really all things Black studies. Because just before you arrived, we were talking about a part of Judy's Disforming the Canon in his introduction, where he
Hmm.
talks about the he talks about this sort of crisis of the liberal arts,
Yeah.
mimesis, oikonomia, and techne, right?
Hmm.
And then he says that as long as Afro-American studies is must sort of demonstrate either its instrumental value or cultural worth, it will remain firmly in Western modernity's organizational model of knowledge. And so I saw that as really connected to what you're saying about this textual attitude and its the hope or the promise there. And so now I wonder if we might think a bit about the place of the discipline relative to sort of the other work you're doing and thinking about the relationship to area studies. And then there were a bunch of questions about Islamic studies as well, since the other piece we read was very much engaging with thought inside of Islamic studies on race. So I wonder if anyone else would like to jump in at this point. I could keep talking, but I think I will make myself stop.
I just wanted to continue what Professor Hussein is saying about just like understanding um, this sort of shift to the practical versus um, the textual. Um, and this actually led me to a question that I think Professor Hussein was getting at, which was like the sort of position of Black studies when we think about the way in which you are framing this understanding or this idea of philology. And I really did want to understand this sort of relationship from your perspective of how we connect this sort of practice or the sort of orientation of the world through text and reading to um, Black studies. And you describe a lot about just like this work in the humanities. But I really did want to uh, connect this to the function and form of Black studies and whether or not it can be a mechanism for this uh, for philology, essentially.
Great. Is it Trifina?
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Trifina? Okay.
Yes, it is.
If you all could just say your names when you ask your question. So Trifina, I think you've gone right to the heart of the matter of okay, is this engagement with philology really something for Black studies? And the book itself hinges on this, right? So it's a really important question. And to come at it, I just want to back up a little bit by saying that philology is generally conceived as the most uncool form of knowledge discipline you can think of. More than that, it is considered, generally speaking, an old, dusty, irrelevant approach to thinking the world, right? Most notably because in the 19th century, it was viewed as a sort of master science that explained human difference, right? And so when we think about the kind of hierarchy of races according to civilizational difference, according to religion. These were pseudoscientific approaches developed through something called philology that really tied civilizational development to the text that that supposed civilization produced or in the case of Africa, supposedly didn't produce. And so it's ironic or paradoxical, or maybe even absurd that I'm claiming for Black studies philology, right? So that's the kind of context that we should all be clear about. Like it is bizarre that I'm caping for philology, right? But why do I do it? Well, you have to understand that I'm not sure if you all read the overture or you just read the introduction. So the overture in my book is kind of an extended preface, and it's neither a traditional preface nor is it um, a kind of a chapter, but it has elements of both. Like actually start with uh, thinking through Malcolm X's time studying the dictionary while incarcerated, right? And in that experience, in the autobiography of Alex Haley, in the epilogue where Alex Haley is talking about the process of writing the book with Malcolm X, he mentions the moment when Malcolm X remembers the aardvark. And the aardvark is this for Malcolm X is just a memory that he has of studying the dictionary, of reading the dictionary while incarcerated. But in kind of African American lore more broadly, the aardvark becomes kind of a symbol for the beginning of knowledge, right? And in his discussion with Alex Haley, he describes, uh, he says, "Oh, I never will forget that old aardvark." And he's talking to Alex Haley about words and their etymologies. And he says that philology is a tough science, all about how a word can lose its shape, but can keep its meaning from language to language, right? And so here we have documentation of Malcolm X's understanding of philology, which, by the way, is a kind of Anglo-Germanic version of philology, in which the actual kind of morphological transformations of words, right? How he uses the example of Caesar, right, becomes Kaiser and Czar in various European languages. And the point that he's making is that you can identify origins. So this is very much Malcolm X's theory of diaspora, as far as I can tell, that he has this philological theory of diaspora, where he is trying to recognize diasporic belonging, no matter the displacement. And actually, I have an article that I'm is an extension of the overture, and I'm working on it right now and trying to get it out, uh, where I'm actually going deeper, trying to give more background on why philology, right? And so Malcolm X is a very important reference for me. But Malcolm wasn't alone, right? You have people like Sun Ra, who, and I think it was in 73 or 74, he gives courses at UC Berkeley. And the name of the course is The Black Man in the Cosmos. And we have one recording of one of the lectures, and he's breaking down the word human, right? And he points out that this is Hugh man, right? Or like the man of color, right? And it is a very inventive and playful mobilization of philology. Uh, but what is interesting to me is how, especially at mid-century or so, in kind of African American culture, um, language wasn't simply uh meaningless signs that had no relationship to the reference, as is De Saussure's theory of linguistics. uh there was and is, I think, a deep belief that words mean something, right? And so knowing words and their origins uh, is a really powerful tool. And so Muhammad Sharif, who is an independent scholar who lives in Mali, but African American, founded the Sankore Institute, which has published a lot of West African Arabic texts, told me after a talk that I gave that actually in the Nation of Islam, philology was one of the required courses of ministers in the Nation of Islam. And that I didn't know that, but I knew that. And what I mean by that is just growing up, there's a certain sensibility about etymology, word roots, and it's a certain kind of verbal reasoning that is a resource for thinking and resource for theory. And so, my philology, the one that I get from Malcolm X and from this African American tradition, is not this uh, race science. even though, we have to be critical that there are some ways that it's kind of indebted to it. Um, Ultimately, and this is what I argue in even in the overture, but I elaborate in this piece I'm working on, is that um, philology as a human tradition is bigger than just what Europeans did with it in the 19th century. And that actually, if we think about philology generically, right, and think about entire world traditions of philology, and there was a book that Sheldon Pollock, who works in Sanskrit, who's at Columbia, edited a book called World Philology that looks at these traditions of textual learning in India, in East Asia, in the Middle East, and tries to relativize phil European philology. Um, this is a human pursuit. And so I define philology far more generically than it often is defined as quite simply the love of study. And if that's not Black studies, I don't know what is.
I have a question just building off on that. So, would you say, like, I mean, this is kind of an open-ended question, but where does that live? In what discipline does that live? Like this study of philology, like, are we seeing this only sequestered in Black studies? Is this like a broader, like, who gets access to this if we're talking also about Western universities, like how do we integrate? And I know that's kind of the whole question is like, how do we decentralize that European Western standard of what is knowledge? But like for these like specific like Arabic, Ajami like texts, like does that only stay within Black or Islamic studies, or does that like how do we integrate that into other disciplines so that not only those who are specifically looking for that can find it, but those who are have no other way of accessing that type of knowledge? Like, I'm
Mm,
curious your thoughts on that.
hmm That's Amelie.
Oh yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
Amelie.
Amelie. Yeah. Professor Hussein, you got some sharp students. Okay, y'all are coming with it. Uh, so my understanding of Black studies fundamentally is not as a discipline. I don't think Black studies itself is a discipline. Uh, I think if we, follow folks like, Cedric Robinson and C.L.R. James, their descriptions of Black studies, at its earliest institutional form was, as I think Cedric Robinson says something like, it's the critique of Western civilization, right? And the thing about critique is that it, by its very nature, critique can't really be settled into fixed disciplinary postures. Critique is always already antagonistic, right? And so, um, there's debate about this, by the way. There are people who say, no, no, Black studies is a discipline, and they've done a lot of work to discipline and disciplinarize Black studies. But my understanding of the field is that um, uh, the vitality and the strength and the interest of Black studies, even in its institutional forms, are the ways in which it can uh, consistently bring to bear a critique of modern knowledge, right? And I think this is what R.A. Judy in Disforming the Canon in that introduction is saying, right? That um, we are actually trying to stand outside of a disciplinary regime. And so when I think about philology, the reason why actually I want to recoup philology for Black studies and maybe even Black study, and we can talk about that distinction in a second, is that no serious scholar today will call them a philologist. right? It is an obsolete form of knowledge. Even, Edward Said's very important 1978 Orientalism was the definitive critique of philology, right? And yet, in his posthumous Humanism and Democratic Criticism, he calls for a return to philology. And the only way we can really make sense of this movement within Said's thought is that there's a significant shift that takes place between 78 and 2003, right? And that shift really is the Iraq War, in which the former paradigm that used language study and used kind of area experts even, right, was actually done away with the Iraq War. In the Iraq War, there was a move to human terrain systems thinking, right, which was a kind of applied anthropology. Uh, and it was a way of also relying on big data, right, and electronic surveillance, right? And so, you don't really need language experts anymore. And I'm still trying to find the source, but, on the eve of the invasion of the Iraq War, the State Department's Arabic Bureau was actually dissolved, right? And so, for the first time in the history of empire, since Napoleon, who took an entire army of scholars with him to invade Egypt, right? There was a severing of the relationship in the between knowledge and power, and specifically the role of philology in that. And so I think when Edward Said calls for a return to philology in 2003, it's because he recognized that philology is now useless, right? It is not a useful form of knowledge. And so um, it's that uselessness and that obsolescence that I find interesting, right? Because it is not as um, implicated in this instrumental relationship of knowing a population. And this is actually quite relevant for Black studies because if we think about area studies as being place-based knowledge and ethnic studies as being a population-based knowledge, right? There's an inherent risk of Black studies in the university that it produces a useful knowledge for the policing of Black people, right? And so this is what I'm kind of trying to do and recoup is to say that, philology, like Black studies itself, aren't really legible disciplines, and therefore we can work with them. We can kind of be creative and use them otherwise.
I also had one more question I wanted to ask more personally. Why have you picked Senegal to study specifically, and kind of what brought you to that region in West Africa? Because, I'm sure there's lots of Islamic studies, there's lots of African Arabic script, and you focused in on a very particular part, which, I am from, which I find interesting. And I
Mm.
think like as I was reading your work, I found myself reacting, kind of being like surprised, even because a lot of the things you're arguing that like should be brought into, this idea of like capital K knowledge, like is my default, like these are cultures and practices and languages that like I hear and I know and I have lived and grown up with. And so like I think that just pushed me to think in a way that's like, oh, this like my epistemology, my idea of knowledge is like centered in these two realms, because obviously I'm in like the Western space, and in a Western university, but also raised by Senegalese parent,
Yeah.
with his
Where's your family from, if I can ask?
they're from Dakar in Chess and
Okay,
Casamance.
Chess. Casamance. Okay, so Jola?
Mm, Jola?
Jola or Wolof?
Wolof.
Wolof, okay. Okay. Dagna Wolof? Tutti? Wala
A little
Tutti
bit.
Tutti? Okay, okay. Yeah. So, I think I could say I can't really say I chose Senegal. I think it kind of chose me. When I was an undergraduate at Morehouse College in Atlanta, historically black college, I was the editor of the Maroon Tiger, and which was the student newspaper. And there was a trip our sophomore year that Spelman was organizing to Medina by Cadillac to work with not NGO 10,000 Girls, and they were looking for French speakers. And at that point, I had been to South Africa, I had been to Nigeria in my first year at Morehouse, and so here was going to be my third trip to the continent by my second year at Morehouse, and I had some French, and so they were excited to have me along as a French speaker and as the editor of the newspaper, so I could write stories and things. And in that trip, I was I accompanied the SGA president at the time, Leon Doy, who was Senegalese and who was kind of playing this role of culture ambassador, connecting these black colleges to this very unique community. What's unique about this community, there were Tijani Sufis, right? So Tijanis are, a Sufi brotherhood. They're interested in the experience of divine knowledge through various ritual practices and kind of spiritual guidance also. And this particular community had been a hub of African American Muslims since at least the late 70s. And so it's a very cosmopolitan part of one of the smaller cities in Senegal. And so there's a very famous African American Islamic school uh, there. And there's a recent book that came out called Black Muslim Freedom Dreams that Samiha Rahman has just published about kind of this community and how African American Muslims send their children to be educated in the school, the African American Islamic Institute. Anyway, at that time, I didn't know all this, but I was taken to greet the Sheikh, Sheikh Hassan Sise, and we sat in the room where he was receiving guests. And we sat in a little semicircle, and there were these little semicircles all around the room. And amid these semicircles of people sitting in the sheikh's kind of study and bedroom, people were speaking different languages, right? Wolof, French, Hausa, Arabic, right? And the sheikh was engaging in all of those conversations fluidly, without losing a beat. And the room was just filled, you know, floor to ceiling with books, mostly in Arabic, but some in some other languages. And I was at that point kind of in between a history and an English major, and I was interested in a Black literature that wasn't in European languages. As much as I was interested in um, kind of Anglophone and Francophone, anti-colonial writing, um, I felt like there had to be something beyond that. And so when I saw this very learned person coming from a tradition that I really didn't know anything about. And I said, okay, I have to learn more about what tradition he represents. And so I would eventually go on to do a Fulbright fellowship in Egypt, where I studied Arabic for a year and a half. Then I went to graduate school in New York. And I was looking at northern Nigeria, right? It was actually, there's just a huge Arabic production there as well. I was interested in Arabic literacy in Africa. But my I had kind of landed in a department, the only department that I got into. I applied to many places, but the one that I found myself had a Senegalese scholar. There was another Mamadou Diouf historian, and then Colombia also had Souleymane Bachir Dieng, a famous Senegalese philosopher. And so it's just kind of at a certain point, I was exerting a lot of effort to like find the right course of study and what place I should do to what was like optimal or something. And at a certain point, I just realized that, you know what? I've had this experience in Senegal. I have these brilliant scholars who are Senegalese. Uh, Maybe the path of least resistance, is to study Senegal. And thankfully, I follow that intuition because I can't imagine really studying anywhere else at this point.
How do you think the like the scholarship you ended up doing would have been different had you, stumbled into working into a different country?
Oh, it would have certainly been different. It's a good question. It would have been different. I can't say how because it's kind of counterfactual, but in the scholarship on Islam in Africa, Senegal is overrepresented, right? And there are some reasons that have to do with the colonial history. There are some reasons that have to do with the current political economy of research, right? Senegal is a fairly comfortable, relatively politically stable. The archives are accessible, well organized. And so there are a certain set of infrastructures, which fundamentally are colonial infrastructures that facilitate research, right? Now, there is a very important critique within the field of Islam in Africa that, okay, too many people work on Senegal, Islam in Senegal, right? But for me, I'm interested in the sedimentation of those legacies, and I'm trying to think them through. Right? So, um, for me, it's not simply, okay, there's too much work here. Let me look somewhere else. I want to ask the question, okay, well, why is there so much work here? You know? And so Sheikh Musa Kamara actually becomes really vital because he's an example of the investments the colonial state made into knowing its colonies, right? And so, it had I worked on Guinea, for example, it would have been much harder, right? So Guinea is very close. It kind of borders Senegal. Mauritania, there's a lot more Arabic texts, right? But there's a connected but different kind of history of social organization. Now, Kamara, of course, he kind of straddles the Senegal and the Mauritanian zone. Um, and he actually traveled and studied in both Mauritania and Senegal and Guinea. And it's important to say that the countries that exist today didn't exist the way they do now in the time of like Cameron's life. So it would have inevitably been different. And I want to insist that that's not a bad thing, right? because I come at this from a literary point of view, and I think this is one of my most important contributions to the field of Islam and Africa in particular, this literary sensibility, is that the work, the singular work that I can do or someone else might do doesn't discount it because someone else can't reproduce it, right? Like the actual um, writing a book that only you can write in the tradition of kind of literary studies that I situate myself in doesn't like isn't a knock against you. And so I had I looked anywhere else, it would have been a completely different book. And that's okay, right? This isn't science. And it doesn't need to pretend to be like social science often does. But thanks, Jamie.
Hi, my name is Naher. Um, I had a question that's maybe kind of further back in our conversation, um, but it's in regards to the talk that you gave at Source of Knowledge Bookstore, um, and the way that you kind of describe or like you preview Kamara's work as like lost between these two intellectual regimes, like one that shows promise, like a like of an initial investment in his work, um, and the textual attitude, and then the other one that overpowers it being like this, priority on surveillance, like the numerical, also like racial common sense, like the fact that people, in the transition, um, that this site is no longer viewed as like generative or um, able to produce what, initially like lured him in with the promise of value. Um, and well, one, I want to talk, or I want to hear you talk about what you think is lost when we kind of like approach this interaction between like Kamara and Gaydon, the publisher, like out of context, like from our post-colonial moment, like just the limitations of like us looking at it from our time now. That was my initial question, but then also earlier in our talk, you kind of talked about how you don't like this, like you don't that I don't know that it might be something. It's not so isolated anymore, like that. Well, I'll just actually put the first thing down on the table.
Cool, cool. And we can talk about it now here. And actually it makes me actually want to ask you, right? Because it seemed like you had some thinking behind some of the limitations of thinking his context from our post-colonial vantage. I mean, it seems like you've been thinking about him. I would be curious to hear from you what you think some of the limitations might be.
I think, well, something that I've been really trying to practice, like, is kind of when I read that, like, the interest um, of this publisher who had been like, publishing like other indigenous writers and him being a part of like the French like colonial administration, but showing like interest. That was interesting to me because I just kind of thought I was thinking about like the just like from like my vantage point, like where does this like interest come from, like existing in a post-colonial moment, like having like why am I not able to contend with that moment within its context? And what are the limitations with my approach and seeing like how does this interaction hold up to like my time? Like what really wanting to instill in myself the value of like evaluating an interaction within its context, and really
Mhm.
that requires me being embedded in that context and just kind of examining that just so I think that's where the question kind of
Yeah,
comes.
yeah. I think what you're describing is something like the historical imagination, right? Like the capacity to view a thing not from our own historical position, but that of another historical position. It's really hard. It's unnatural, right? And the discipline of history, to the extent I know something about it, you know what I mean? I'm no historian, you know. I did have an advisor who's a historian, but we always fought. And but it is this way of rigorously trying to attend to not our individual perspective, but that of another. There's this great quote, I can't remember who said it, but like the past is a foreign country, right? So it's strange to us. And we use tools and methods from history to kind of alienate us from ourselves, and to try to encounter the past on its own terms. And so, in a lot of ways, when I tell Kamran's story to audiences, whether they be in Senegal, whether they be in the US, or now I'm based here in Morocco, um, it's kind of surprising that there were these colonial officials that were trying to publish indigenous authors, right? It's kind of surprising that these colonial officials uh, were writing letters in Arabic that had like Muslim prayers in them, right? Now, I mean, we can kind of say that, these were just conventions of writing and that they ultimately didn't mean anything. But at the same time, I think we have to sit with the fact that, well, they did have these exchanges. And Kamara is kind of inconvenient for us today when, like to be decolonial is like the cool thing. It's inconvenient to know that he actually considered these administrators his friends. So like what do we do with that? He's not a radical by any means. And he's someone who like politically I don't see myself aligned with. But I think the work is to, from your historical position in the present, try to encounter the historical position of another in the past. And it's not to say that the experience and the perspective of the person in the past overrides one's own historical positioning, but that they should be made to encounter, right? And there's a very important theorist of hermeneutics or interpretation, Gadamer, Hans Gadamer, and he talks about like the fusion of horizons, right? The fusion of horizons, and it's that you're trying to collect these different perspectives and see kind of where they might converge, right? Because I read Kamran with my own baggage and my own questions, and some of them perhaps were answered, but also in trying to confront and wrestle with what Kamran was wrestling with, which I ultimately fail at doing, actually new kinds of questions emerge from the friction between those two kind of positions. And so um, I think it's a kind of a superpower in some ways to be able to do that. And it's really important that it is not to reduce it to a tool, but it's a tool in our toolbox for thinking.
What you're saying here is reminding me of something that I know your Sheikh Ari Judy also sort of talks about when he critiques the concept of resistance, and that it's not his favorite word, it's not his favorite concept, and I think I think his kind of replacement, not a direct replacement, but another way of kind of doing something is to say that he prefers to think with something or think against it, like what he finds useful to sort of think with or not. And I was wondering if you could sort of speak to that, like if you see a connection in that way um, between your project and what you're doing in textual life and how he's thinking about a critique of the concept of resistance.
Hmm. I can say generally that uh, R.A. Judy is someone who I discovered, or discover isn't the right word, but who I first encountered in Cairo. I read his Forming the Canon, and I didn't understand anything. Not a thing, right? I was doing my Fulbright grant, and I just nothing. I knew it was important. I knew that, but I didn't get it. Years later, I think during my orals exams, I think I read it again. And I think I understood a little bit more. I remember making this very exhaustive outline of all the chapters, trying to kind of collect my thoughts and understand parts of the argument. And, but still, I think I remember having starting to develop some like critiques because in grad school you think that's what you're supposed to do, and you think that you're somehow able to develop critiques like, and so I think there was a moment where I invented some kind of critiques I had of just forming the American canon, which I can't even tell you what they were at this point, to be honest. But then a couple years ago, I went back to it again, and it like felt like a different book, And I was like, okay, maybe I should just be quiet now and try to like really think this through. And so that's just in general. I wanted to share that as something really important that you know, uh, um, you know, a good book, something that is the fruit of years of labor and experience, doesn't just simply, kind of give itself up to a kind of total understanding. You need to read things again and again, and you need more experiences. You need to work out your own arguments and ideas. You need to come back to it. And so, just forming the American canon and um, R.A. Judy is a prime example for me where it's been a years long process of learning. But on the question of resistance specifically, could you just elaborate a little bit more on what you're thinking of?
Yeah, it's I mean like you're saying my kind of experience with his work has been similar where it's like I didn't fully understand it the first time. I understood a little more the second time. I understood a little more the third time that I read it. And my kind of exposure to my entrance to reading Disforming the Canon was through, seeing that all these other people that work on so-called slave narratives haven't talked about this book. And I'm more familiar with that kind of Black Islam literature, but then he's talking about that. And why isn't he part of that kind of mini canon? And so, and I realized once I started reading it, where I don't know what's going on in this book, even though I'm familiar with that stuff, there's something happening here that's really exciting and interesting.
Hmm.
And I think, I want to say it's in his interview with Fred Moten.
Hmm.
And part of why his critique about resistance stuck out to me is because it was one of the things that was easier to understand for me, like when I was first started reading his work. Um, and even then, I think I understand only a little bit of it, where I'm more intrigued than anything and hoping you could explain it to me, honestly. Like
Yeah.
there is like I'm intrigued by the critique of resistance in that, is it is it a critique of a critical posture where critique is one's only work and where is the building of something? Or does he mean something else? Does he mean, that like what you talk about in Textual Life, um, on page 12 about resistance versus collaboration, and that there's something lost in just kind of having that like we can't understand Sheikh Kamara and what he's doing in that kind of and really the other movements in this kind of neat binary. Like, is there something
Yeah.
that he's doing there? So part of why I find it intriguing is because I don't think I fully understand it yet.
Yeah, yeah. So I think conventionally, like in Black studies, resistance has been a very important category for kind of organizing our work, right? That like the task is to identify stories of resistance against slavery, against colonization. And, I think it's in part influenced by a certain Marxist tradition, where, identifying resistance is identifying agency, right? That, okay, what people do in the face of oppression, they don't simply accept it. And there, there's some really important reasons for this. On the one hand, just for the sake of establishing historical truth, that like people don't accept oppression, right? Uh, but beyond that, then there's an important motivational factor, right? So if we only tell stories of oppression, then we're less likely to inspire resistance, right? And so I think there's a very deep tradition within Black studies of focusing on resistance for that dual purpose of documenting just really what has happened and to motivate, inspire continued resistance. I think there was a kind of, at a certain point, a third way in Black studies that saw in the fugitive an instance where, stealing away, right, when one is property, that and we might frame it as the most significant act of resistance is theft of one's self that is property, right? But then it's also a kind of um, appreciation of that because like power is kind of capillary, right? It's not simply one side against the other, that we needed kind of more sophisticated models to think of think through people's relationship to um, power. And so the fugitive or the mundane, the everyday kind of become ways of recognizing an important like resource for social life that isn't necessarily heroic or in that heroic register of resistance, but is really important for understanding.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by how like this framing of this fugitive hermeneutics of blackness that you have, and we've been doing a lot of thinking in this class on um, an understanding of blackness as a theoretical achievement of Black studies, as you frame it. Um, I I have more questions about that, and I think everyone else has more questions too, but I'm wondering if we might take a 5-minute break so that we can get through to, the rest of the class, because I do not want to cut this conversation off
Sure.
really. So how about we keep it at 5 minutes, and it's 3:05 here according to my clock, so we'll come back at 3:10 in 5 minutes.
All right. Sounds good.
All right.
And also, if I can just say, maybe to help students, I'm also interested in like, the things you're thinking about. the ways that anything you read from me or others that help you think about the kind of projects you're doing. So, anything is open, fair game. Ask me anything. And I'm happy to like think with you and to wrestle with some of these questions. So take the break to um, maybe think in that register as well.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. If you are back. We do have these sort of like long-ish term projects that we're thinking about for the end of the semester. And um, I think it's a really generous and exciting offer that Professor Marsh is making here with like ask me anything with whatever you're thinking about. And so um, I would love to hear what you all are thinking and taking him up on that offer. Um, I still have my own questions, but I think we still have a bunch of students who haven't had the opportunity to speak just yet. So I'm gonna hold on to my stuff and um, reopen up the floor.
I'll just say I've really been enjoying these questions. So this is a great conversation. I feel really lucky to have such sharp interlocutors among you all.
So I have a question regarding the piece around reconsidering race in Islamic studies. Um, I think within this essay, you argue that like taking Blackness seriously requires refusing race, and even like unsettling the epistemological world that it produces. And so earlier in your discussion of the the fugitive hermeneutics of Blackness, you suggest that it attains to like what modern knowledge can't fully contain. So I guess my question is, do you see Black epistemology as something Islamic studies can incorporate while also like maintaining its discipline and structurally the same discipline? Or does that mean taking Blackness seriously requires like rethinking some of the foundational like epistemological thought altogether? And like where is this line between the reform and the transformation of the study?
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. That's a great question. And I have to admit that I come to Islamic studies as an interloper. So in technical terms, I'm not in Islamic studies as it's typically viewed, right? So my kind of primary field for my graduate training was Islam in Africa, which, funny enough, isn't a part of Islamic studies, right? Uh, but I was in an area studies department, and um, the location of Islam in Africa outside of Islamic studies, but in more area studies, already is an indication of
You were cut off and you left off with a really critical part.
I'm not exactly sure where it cut off, but I'll just say that Islamic studies. So I come at this from outside of the field, tech in a kind of a narrowly defined Islamic studies, right? That I wasn't trained in a typical Islamic studies kind of department, but I'm interested in the study of Islam broadly construed, but coming as I do from a more area studies background. Um, but the fact that I can be a scholar of Islam in Africa while not being Islamic studies is an indication of the kind of structures that you are naming. Uh, excuse me. And ultimately, what I'm saying is to refuse race is to refuse the modern organization of knowledge, right? And for the study of Islam even if we say broadly understood, if it were to do that, it would also be refusing its confinement into kind of the space that it occupies within the modern organization of knowledge. And so, in several ways, in this essay, I am pushing for for a refusal in a more moderate way than someone like R.A. Judy is. I think R.A. Judy is far more radical in the refusal of the order of knowledge. I'm a little bit more moderate, in pointing to the possibilities, even while kind of trying to show how we might do the kind of production of normal science in these fields. So what I mean to say with all that is, um, taking even like Islamic normativity seriously, as I do in the end of the essay, to say that, okay, what would it mean to actually think with uh, the hadith around strangeness and actually saying that this is a value for scholarship as opposed to like transparency or kind of, these often unstated values we have for knowledge production. And say that actually maybe these are paradigms that might be unsettled a little bit. And so ultimately, in short, yes, I'm saying that I'm not saying that we have to kind of throw everything out. It's not it's such a in some ways it's not such a radical gesture. But if we follow the argument all the way through, it is kind of fundamental in its call for a kind of different kind of thinking of the world.
I guess I've been thinking a lot about like cultivating this like different way of thinking about the world, in terms of like how we're raising and educating like our younger generations. And I guess I was just wondering how you might approach thinking about or like imagine cultivating this like humanist textual attitude that values complexification in the context of like youth education, which is so focused on standards and like benchmarks for knowledge and cognitive development, um, which I guess is like kind of a very anti-humanist way of approaching education. I don't.
Yeah, the past couple of days I've been reading this essay by Erich Auerbach, who was a philologist, a German philologist, who, you know, during World War II ends up in Turkey. And he's often considered one of the kind of foundational theorists of modern literary study. And he has this essay on philology and Weltliteratur that Edward Said actually translates from German into English. And there's a line in here that has been sticking with me for the past couple of days. I'm just gonna, if you'll indulge me, because it's kind of on my tablet, but I was just looking at this earlier. Uh, so in this essay is trying to make a case for world literature and how it emerges at a point when difference and diversity is increasingly disappearing on the world stage, right? That in 1952, when he's writing, there's a certain degree of standardization of world cultures that made it not such a far-fetched idea that human difference might be eliminated, right? Now, there's some weird stuff going on. There's some exclusions and what's included in world literature and not. But he's ultimately making a case that we need world literature or Weltliteratur precisely because it kind of holds together diversity, the unity of diversity of the human experience expressed through literature. And that consciousness is inherently historical. But he says that that understanding is really challenged because there is a ahistorical system of education. Uh, and he says some other things. And for him, the task of the philologist is actually to bring back the historical perspective. And for him, historical isn't simply, okay, context or this is what happened in the past, but understanding um, what were the kind of internal spirit of an age trying to express. The reason why I'm thinking about this in relation to your question, because when he says a historical system of education, he's describing a kind of standards-based system that is all about the measure, like cognitive measurements, etc. And I have to say at the outset, I don't have like an answer for how to do this at a system-wide level. Uh, I do think that the need to address scale is where a lot of our problems lie, right? Because um, the kind of large scale thinking is a process of the elimination of difference. And it seems to me that thinking in and through difference, thinking in and through antagonism, is a really important part of understanding uh, kind of history, society, our politics, um, and also like creating a situation where we can actually like think and speak across difference. Um, so all that to say, um, I've been thinking a lot about literacy lately and how fundamental um, teaching literacy is, not only in like the college classroom, but um, in non-school settings. Because it seems to me that we kind of take literacy for granted, but much like this moment when Auerbach is writing, where kind of world literature might have been taken for granted, um, is precisely like this moment where we see the effects of like shorter attention spans, that like we need to like hold on and latch to some deeper understanding of literacy. And so I'm involved in some kind of non-university based popular education type of efforts and initiatives. And increasingly, I'm just thinking that like literacy should probably be the basis of those programs. And I'll just add that literacy for me isn't simply the decoding of sounds and words, right? Literacy is goes deeper than that and is about um, developing fluency in traditions of meaning, right? Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, can you talk more about the education that you're cultivating outside of the institution, what that looks like, and
Yeah.
if you're doing it with a collective or what that's about.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, at present, I'm kind of in between projects, but I can speak really about what I was doing in Newark before I left. And in Newark, most importantly, we had a Palestine Solidarity encampment, and our encampment lasted for 40 days. And we founded the People's University in the encampment, and it was essentially a community of mutual aid and education. And the thing about the space in the encampment is that um, it was put on, organized by a collective known as the Newark Solidarity Coalition, which was a convergence of kind of student organizers, uh, university workers who'd gotten to know each other during a historic strike in 2023, and most importantly, a certain movement infrastructure provided by the Newark Water Coalition, which is a an organization that was addressing the lead crisis in Newark, in which the lead levels of the city of Newark was exponential, much like Flint, Michigan, and in other places. Um, but since the pandemic, the Newark Water Coalition had been doing food distributions, water distributions, and so they had a bit of an infrastructure. And together, these different kind of groups of people in different social positions came together and created the Newark Solidarity Coalition in the encampment. And then in the last year and a half or so, subsequent to that, I had been a part of the Newark Solidarity Coalition study group that was trying to reflect on the experience of the encampment, but also its place in the kind of terrain of movement in and around Newark, and trying to just to learn lessons from the encampment. And we were working on an article that's going to come out soon. And so that was one space that I was active in. But I'm also active in a university adjacent space, a decolonial collective in Senegal called the Groupe d'Action d'Études Critiques, which was founded in the pandemic, essentially. And our first kind of event was a study group called What is a Study Group, in which we translated into French and Wolof Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's The Undercommons. And, also was doing political education within our faculty union at Rutgers, this last year. So, they're kind of varied um, spaces, uh, but, all trying to bring study to action.
I also have a question. And this is very much coinciding with a sort of research direction for myself. And so you mentioned this concept of algorithmic attitudes toward
Mhm.
the end of the introduction, and about how this understanding of knowing in the world today is very much tied to or related to big data. And I am doing work that really does focus on AI and how these models influence the certainly labor trends that we see today, specifically the gig economy and also micro work. And I am very interested in this concept of algorithmic attitudes and how you would say that this orientation toward the world that is leaning towards data and like data systems. How this coincides with this return to practicing philology and thinking about what technology's role could be in that particular discourse.
Yeah. So this is something I'm actively thinking through right now. You know, when I wrote that in the book, it was kind of a gesture, you know, like it wasn't the heart of what I was doing, but I was trying to describe a way of not reading that is already anticipated in the colonial period, right? Where Kamara's text was, you know, there was an effort to reduce or to extract from, and that was even continued paradoxically in the nationalist period, where using social scientific method to discipline a kind of overwhelmingly abundant set of texts uh, operated through these procedures of quantification, of reduction, you know, what have you. And when I was thinking through the Edward Said and about what was happening in 2003 and what was quickly becoming apparent, you know, as I was finishing the book about where we were headed in terms of like, you know, the algorithm, where, you know, this was a way of describing what I was feeling in my everyday life without necessarily having done the research just yet. Now, since writing the book this semester, I've been teaching a course called Technologies of the Word, from orality to generative AI in Africa and beyond. And I'm actually trying to think through a bit more about, okay, well, what did I mean by algorithmic attitude? And also just thinking about these different modalities and the different qualities of engagement. So we move through kind of the scholarship on orality, uh, thinking about the invention of writing and the kind of cognitive ruptures that that entailed. Um, you know, moved to kind of Marshall McLuhan and print, media studies, and um, started to kind of look at uh, the kind of data systems, datification, and AI in this course. And I'm still, I don't know ultimately is the answer of what I meant fully by that. But what I'm interested in is um, thinking through something as simple as what is the consequence of encountering a text through a search query as opposed to having to read a whole book, right? So Robin D.G. Kelley, very important Black Studies scholar, uh, had an interview on the Black Studies podcast recently, and he made this point about how, you know, when he was in school, um, you know, if you wanted to like learn something or you wanted to find something out, you had to like read a lot just to get this one little bit. But in so doing, you were exposed to an entire network of ideas and references that had a context, right? But when you can do Control F in a text and you find your quote, um, you don't get the process involved of finding it. And so the kind of synapses that are is the connections that are established at a cognitive level aren't actually defined. And if we think about if we understand neuroplasticity as uh, you know, the capacity of the brain to make connections, i.e., learning. You know, if we understand this is what learning is, then um, more and more of the technologies we're using to navigate an overwhelming amount of information, which are, quite honestly, like we need tools because it's so much, right? But the what is afforded in scale, there's also this constraint or this trade-off in which our like cognition as subjects is compromised, and so um, ultimately we are delegating responsibility to the algorithm, and it's like I I had a kind of heart to heart with my students. I was like, okay, you won't be penalized. Just tell me, how are you actually using AI, right? Like let's open up the machine and like show me your workflow. And I made the assignments actually AI workflow. And I kept hearing them say something over again that was starting to trouble me, where they were saying, okay, they use it for everything from what to eat for lunch to, an assignment. But there were things that, okay, we know that we can't trust what the AI says, but they also said we use it as a guide. At no point in human history has any kind of concept of knowledge has it been acceptable to say that this thing is knowledge, but it's not trustworthy or we can't trust it. And so I'm just like trying to understand, and I don't have the answers of what does it mean in world historical terms that we are now at a point where there's something we don't trust, but using it to guide us in our daily lives.
But I feel very similarly, just in terms of just being very skeptical about utilizing these AI in replacement for these sort of like day-to-day activities and things like that. And it's interesting that you mentioned the sort of inaccuracy that AI can enable at times, especially considering the fact that the way that I like to think about it, or the way that I'm thinking about it in my research, is that it's sort of like a hijacking of intellectual thought, and it's taking from our mind and our thoughts, and it's sort of this word keeps coming up, the like standardizes it in a way, and it, it I it does so in a way where like you said, there is this like huge trade-off in the learning process where it's definitely compromising to ourselves. But sorry, I'm like talking out loud. I'm like trying to think along with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we are, like in world historical terms. Like we don't know how this thing is. Like these are open questions, and I think they're the questions of our time that we have to wrestle with. And I don't think anyone has the answers. And if anyone tells you they do have the answers, they're probably trying to sell you something.
Mm, I concur. But thank you. It was great to hear your thoughts on the matter.
I have a kind of similar question in the vein of technology and like Black studies. You talked a lot in the talk you did at the bookstore about like the replacement of more like qualitative work with like statistical work. How do you feel that like do you think that the discipline of Black studies should try to like focus on that, like switch towards like statistics, or should it, like try to use more qualitative stuff to continue on and like kind of advance?
Yeah. So first, I should say that, like, Black Studies isn't just one. And, what I offer in my engagement with the humanities uh, is on kind of one end. But there's also like a very hard social scientific Black studies, a one that is like oriented to like policy work and thinking about like education in public schools. And so I'm not one to say that like that is like bad work or we shouldn't be doing that. I think it has its own training and disciplines and set of questions that I'm less well positioned to really go deep on. But I do want to like permit it. I do want to say like there's a place for it. And it's actually why I like the work of someone like Olufemi Taiwo, in his Reconsidering Reparations, right? Olufemi Taiwo is a philosopher, and he's an analytic philosopher. Uh, and yet he's really interested in being grounded in like data and the empirical. And so he has this concept, global racial empire, which the way he renders it is very useful. And I consider it to be a kind of middle level theory. And what I mean by middle level theory is that a lot of contemporary Black studies is in the domain of high theory. When we talk about fugitivity, especially like, admittedly, this is kind of like high theory. But someone like Olufemi Taiwo is very much engaged in those. He provides a framework to bring together the empirical with kind of this high theory. And so that mid-level theory, especially in the space of like the undergraduate classroom, I think is really important. Um, he talks about like the differential global racial empire is like creating differences um, at nestled scales. And so he's able to talk about racial injustice as colonialism in India at the same time as talking about it as segregation in contemporary Chicago, right? And so I think, and he has like an appendix in his book where he actually is like modeling effects of climate change and how to quantify it in movements to use the argument for reparations as a preparation for climate catastrophe, right? So I think this is a really great example of kind of Black studies work that does a bit of both. My own, uh, for my own interest, though, I'm going more and more in the direction of aesthetics and aesthetic education, right? So, I mean, this going back to the question of literacy, right? Um, More and more, my kind of intro classes is simply about practicing the skills of noticing, describing, and questioning, right? Which ultimately I think are aesthetic skills, right? Perception. They're about training and perception. So what do I mean by aesthetics? Well, um, it's about the training of a sensitivity to objects, right? If we think about what is like what's wrong with the algorithmic attitude, if you will, it's this unthinking or automatic/automated way of relating to the world, right? Which is race science, right? The first race science was the first algorithmic attitude of, okay, there are these on a visual basis, we see these people who exist in the world, and we can make all sort of judgments about them and what they're good for and how they might contribute to the economy based on this, how they look, what we can see, right? And the algorithmic attitude is building on that uh, through several iterations. And so this is a way of not feeling, right? Of being insensitive to difference. And so for me, an aesthetic education is about actually cultivating that sensitivity, right? Because the machine doesn't feel. The machine can reason as well as we can, many times, often better than, much faster, much quicker, right? And so, since Descartes, I think there's been an overinvestment in cognition as the kind of sign of humanity. But I think the appearance of AI and recent research around human consciousness, which is actually making the case about embodiment, right? There are like these cases of people no longer having like a neocortex, right? But they're still conscious. And so scientists are coming to a greater appreciation that actually what is defining the human isn't cognition as much as it is the body and our capacity to feel, right? And so I think it's the capacity to think and feel. And so for me, the aesthetic education is where we practice and enhance and cultivate our capacity to feel, to have these sensitivities toward the world and towards difference.
That's a great transition to what might be our kind of concluding question here, that I'm wondering about, partly because I feel myself to be in a similar place, like coming off of, publishing your first book, yeah, and there's a set of questions that inform that. And I'm curious to know what's next for you, not in terms of necessarily like a neat formulated project that, okay, I'm going to write a paper on this, I'm going to do that, but more like questions that have been raised for you,
Yeah.
or questions that have gone unanswered until this point, and you want to look at them in a different way. Like, where are you thinking next? What's lingering? What are you interested in, and what are you over? I mean, there's things like, for me,
Yeah.
having written a book about it, I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that ever again. I'm done with it. So,
Yeah.
where are you in those terms?
This is really challenging for me. Um, because I have a lot of interests and a lot of possible paths I might go in. And I have like a solid 3 or 4 book ideas. And it's like, okay, so on what basis does one choose the next book? And I think I've settled upon continuing in my study of Sheikh Musa Kamara. So in the book, I say that, this is but an introduction. And I think that um, the greatest service I can have at this moment is kind of following through of what was an introduction and to kind of work out a bit more empirically, um, Kamara's archive. And so I have this idea for what I'm calling the Kamara Portal, a digital philology of the Greater Western Sahel. So it's really interesting, right? His major work, Zuhur al-Basatin fi Tarikh al-Sawadin, Flowers from Among the Gardens in the History of the Blacks. This monumental work that he writes several times. We have 3.5 versions of this text. But until today, scholars are not sure if these are different versions of the same text, if they're different texts entirely, or if it's something that challenges what we even understand a text to be, right? And so there's like a pretty concrete empirical question to work out, but at the same time that will have important theoretical implications. And then when you add on the technological piece to it, and trying to create a kind of platform for accessing the works across several languages, and trying to kind of do some comparisons and kind of computational analysis, uh, which, one would be excused for being surprised that I'm talking about computational analysis, given what I say in the first book about the statistical and the numeric, et cetera. But it's the it's like the frontier of my own understanding. And my goal is to put into practice and to materialize what I was calling appreciation, right? So how do we engage Arabic texts from West Africa that is not about taking something away from them, but rather bringing something into it, right? And so I want to actually use, new technologies to enrich the works of Sheikh Musa Kamra, not to extract from them. And in so doing, I want this portal to be an aperture into the theological and ontological and spatial imaginaries that define the space of Sheikh Musa Kamara's Sahel.
That's really exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing all that. Um, so that's the end of our time, really. And I just wanted to say thank you so much, and to all of you for asking amazing questions. Um, I will definitely have to invite you to come back. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, certainly. I would love to. And I just want to say to all of you all who asked questions and even those who did, I mean, you all are asking graduate level
Yeah.
questions for sure. Like this was absolutely, graduate seminar level work that you all are doing. So, keep at it. And, you know, uh, I mean, if you want to, there's also, if you find yourself in other paths, also keep at it. It's that quality of mind that you're bringing to the work, the seriousness of your engagement. We need to take that out into the world too. And so it's not just this academic thing, but, we need to love study no matter where we are and what we're doing.
That's a perfect note to end on. So thank you so much.
Thank you.